is very good to be here, to see many familiar faces and also many new faces. If the theme of last week's reading was faith, then this week's theme must be water. During these next 3 Sundays of Lent, the lectionary begins to focus our attention toward preparation for baptism at the Easter Vigil, which is the penultimate time in the church year for baptism of the faithful. In the early church, catechumens, as they were called, had been studying and preparing for 2 to 3 years for baptism. Imagine that. These final weeks before Easter were a time of intensified prayer, self-examination, study, and fasting. Water, as one of the primary symbols of baptism, is then an appropriate motif for our readings today. In our first reading, the people are thirsty and they are angry. They are angry with Moses. Why did he and God bring them out of Egypt to let them die of thirst in the wilderness? Although God had been faithful in delivering them from bondage of Pharaoh and had provided them with food, the oasis at Rephidim had run dry and they had no water. And they again lose faith that God can save them from the harshness of the desert. Moses rebuked their lack of faith and consulted the Lord, who told him, "Strike the rock with the rod I've given you, and the water will flow in abundance." And so it was. Again, God provides them what they need. The psalm for today recalls this incident and urges us not to be as hard of heart as those who doubted God in the desert. Then in the Gospel, Jesus speaks to the woman of Samaria about the boundless water of life, which God offers to all who seek it. There are significant reasons that Scripture has so much to say about water. The land in the Bible stories is a desert land, much like the land we live in. And water is scarce and absolutely necessary for life. Wandering in the desert without water that's drinkable can indeed be a life-threatening prospect. So it's no accident that the Bible uses water as a metaphor for the life-giving promises that God offers us. Jesus and the woman at the well begin their conversation talking about the actual water that she has come to get for her family. But before long, Jesus changes the direction of the dialogue and begins talking about living water. What is this living water? He says, whoever drinks the water of the Samaritan well will become thirsty again. But he says those who partake of the living water will never thirst again. We have, each of us, all of us, have many things in our lives that, like the well of Samaria, satisfy us only briefly, and few that constitute living water that never fails us. The water of the Samaritan well is all around us. We don't have to look too far or think too hard to know this. We see it in our relentless human quest for what I call the 4 Ps. The quest for pleasure, power, popularity, and prestige. Our unsatisfied thirst for something deeper and more lasting leads us to what we think will satisfy it. So we continue in the endless cycle of seeking, looking in all the wrong places for all the wrong things. But we find all too quickly that these gods that we seek after are false gods and that they fail to satisfy us. For the water they offer leaves us even more thirsty. No matter how much we drink from this well, we only want more. For our real quest, whether we're conscious of it or not, is not for those 4 Ps, Our real desire is for unconditional love and acceptance. Something the 4 Ps can never give us. And the love we desire most is the only love that never changes, and the only love that truly satisfies. It is the limitless love that flows so freely from the heart of God. Yet despite this longing that we have, we dither between the illusionary well of Samaria and the bottomless well of God's love. Within our deepest selves, we know that the water from the 4 Ps can never satisfy. Yet its cool and sparkling wetness is ever so appealing and alluring to us. Where the depths of God's love can sometimes be terrifying. Like the Israelites in the desert, we fear that God, who has actually saved us so often, will abandon us after all. So we don't trust. Perhaps also our fear is that we don't deserve God's deep and limitless love. Maybe this is why the Israelites tested God's gracious providence. That they afraid that they didn't really deserve. I think we're all aware of the increasing numbers of people in our culture, and maybe especially even here, who do extreme sports, out-of-bounds skiers and snowboarders, for example. These people, in their search for grueling, gripping, and grinding thrills, take all sorts of risks with the belief, or at least the hope, that if something bad happens, that they will somehow find me and rescue me. What is it that calls many people to test themselves against nature? Or I wonder if in some less than conscious way, are these thrill seekers really testing God? God, am I worthy that you would save me? Will you really save me, even me, a sinner, even me? And maybe we ask ourselves, like the woman at the well, Sir, why is it that you talk to me, a woman of Samaria? Are we worthy? That's what she was asking. It was scandalous in his time that Jesus would talk to this woman. She was not only a Samaritan, a foreigner, with different religious beliefs and ways of worshiping, but she was also a woman. Jews considered the vessels that the Samaritan Jews for eating and drinking to be unclean, and Jewish rabbis did not speak in public with women. Jesus was not only talking to the woman, but also asking her for a drink of water from her jar. He didn't care about her gender, her position, or her possibly scandalous past. He didn't lecture or berate or shame her. He simply accepted her as she was. He offered her the water that quenches thirst forever. Relationship with God. But then Jesus was always offering life to people on the margins. This week, a foreign woman with a questionable past. Next week, a blind man. It doesn't matter whether or not we deserve it, whether we're from the right or the wrong side of town, whether we worship in the so-called right place or in some other place. It doesn't even matter that we sometimes test God to see if his promises are real. God gave water and manna and quail to the Israelites, despite their skepticism and their most ungracious demands. I wonder if believing that we first have to deserve it is what gets in the way of us seeking and accepting this living water. I wonder if we feel so undeserving of God's love that we figure we'll just go for the consolation prizes. Paul reminds us in today's reading from Romans that we don't have to be deserving. While we were still sinners, he says, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for sinners, not for those who didn't need it. Perhaps what we need to ask from God in this Lenten season is for a sense of daring, for the brashness and the humility to trust in God's goodness, and to exchange the will water of pleasure, power, popularity, and prestige for the ever-flowing, endlessly refreshing water that Jesus offers. If this sounds like an impossible goal, I offer you a suggestion. Don't try to change your whole life at once. It just doesn't work. I think we all know that. The Israelites went through the desert to the Promised Land in stages, not all at once. So just try one small change, one step that seems like a risk, one step that will take us closer to that living water, to that relationship with God that we want. And as we began today speaking about baptism, let's end remembering our baptismal vows. The answer to every change we attempt to make in our lives is always the same. I will with God's help.